to
for those, this is part of an online course. We also will register this webinar because we also share it with a big group of participants that could not be here at this moment. As usual, we will be with a small group of 20 people following this webinar. Bjorn, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, I welcomed you already with a very quick initial, almost title introduction. I will give you the floor to introduce you maybe a little bit more in depth, and then also as a conversation starter, feel free to widely start the conversation with some reflections that you have prepared in advance. After that initial, we call it the Kickstarter round, actually I will open the floor for participants. They can either share their questions through the chat box, which I'm monitoring, and also Kai is doing that, and people are also free to take the microphone, any of those. So with having said that, I'll pass the microphone to you.
Okay, I'm not going to speak for a very long time, but a quick introduction of where I'm coming from is the Danish Board of Technology. We've been working with technology assessments since '86. We used to be public, but are now a non-profit private foundation. There are different traditions of technology assessment. The one that we belong to is what you could call participatory technology assessment, meaning that we engage both citizens and different stakeholders in shaping the technological development that we wish to have. We do that by involving them directly in research and innovation projects, but also in setting strategies, political strategies, and discussing those with policymakers. With regards to future of work, our input here is probably twofold. So I'm going to say a little bit about two things. The first would be citizen participation, and the second would be what is now in the EU called responsible research and innovation. For the first point, I would like to make the case for citizen participation in future discussions about how to shape the future of work in society. By citizen participation, I mean methods for including lay citizens and workers in discussing and setting the framework for their future work. In the current system of dialogue about these things, you have different labor unions, you have industry representatives, but you have no mechanisms for direct participation from citizens/workers. And I would argue that this is a good idea to try to introduce. There are two basic arguments for citizen participation. The one is the normative one, namely that it's democratically fair that citizens and workers are included in discussing decisions that will affect their lives. And the other is instrumental, namely that by doing so, you develop more ownership of decisions made, you develop trust, you develop socially robust and innovative results. So that is one angle that I would like to introduce to this discussion. The other one is about the concrete development of new technology. We've been working for several years, for 15 or 20 years, with the European Commission about what used to be called science in society, and it's now called Science with and for Society, and with a new expression called responsible research and innovation. A guiding principle in responsible research and innovation is public engagement. And again, public engagement is two different things. It's both stakeholder participation and citizen participation. So we've been developing different methods for doing that. And a number of such methods exists for engaging citizens in the early framing of research agendas, which is, you could call the upstream development of new technology, all the way down to the development of concrete innovations such as a health app, nanoproducts, different kind of IT solutions that are about to enter the market. So there are methods for doing that. So this would be maybe an interesting concept to introduce in the discussion about technology. I mean, how can we, through the inclusion of citizens, try to anticipate the effects that new technology will have on their lives and try to shape that development in a way that is, one, less harmful to citizens and workers, and two, more in line with their needs and wishes. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Björn. Can you hear me?
Yes, your voice is a little low.
Okay, I'll try to enhance it. Today I have some issues with the technology, and I'm not the only one, as we are still trying to call in Urvashi. But I think we would like to use some of your reflection points to connect and maybe to ask some further questions on that one. In the meanwhile, I ask all participants, if you have a question, please put it into the chat box right here, and I'll pick it up. And I already got one or two remarks from colleagues here. One is on your big focus on the citizen involvement. When the Future of Work initiative was launched a few years ago, and last year with the focus where we had national dialogues on the future we basically want, one of the big questions that came out of there was indeed, how can we involve more people than, let's say, the traditional stakeholders that are in the tripartite discussion of typical ILO dialogue or conversation between employers, workers, and the government. And in a recent workshop where we both participated, this call for moving beyond tripartite conversation, even someone used, I think our professor from South Africa used the word, let's move into pentagonal discussions, was one of his keywords out there, is something that we definitely take on board in a lot of the discussions what we have. One of the questions is coming back, and you said, like, in order to involve citizens or anything, we are using specific mechanisms, and we're using very specific methods out there. And someone was asking if you could give maybe some concrete examples of those methods in function of some of the projects that you have done, so in order to get some inspiration there. And then a second question I'm getting from someone here said, like, would be interesting if Kai, if you could speak a bit more about the interface between citizen science and policy making. What does this process and potential blind spot look like? And maybe refer to some of the best practices. That's the second entry point. Let me add also a third one, because this is more and more when we started to talk about the influence of technology at work, the discussion of the digital dividends and also the digital divide, which we now basically lively can experience because due to a storm somewhere in a rural area, we were cut out of connectivity. Is kind of the whole technological advance creating an additional division which is going to accelerate the current inequality? Or at the other hand, what we also have seen in several examples is that some new technologies, and specifically in countries where it's not obvious, could create for what we would call a kind of a leap forward, like these kind of frog leaps forward. One of the examples that was been given was the whole evolution of blockchain infrastructure, these kind of decentralized networked infrastructure, which would allow us to, in a very horizontal, participatory, transparent way, to come up with decision making in one way or another. That's maybe very simplified, but the main question: how could technology help us to actually close the gap or the digital divide that is currently on there? So with these three initial questions, I'll give the microphone back to you, Björn.
Okay. I'll try to give two examples of concrete methods for citizen participation. I'll start with a European project that we're now in the process of finishing. It's under Horizon 2020. It's a research project. It's called Simulact. And it is about engaging citizens in all European countries in defining research agendas for the new round of Horizon 2020. For that specific purpose, we made citizen panels. I think around 20 people in each panel in each of the European countries. By citizens, we mean lay citizens, and they have been selected to reflect the demographic diversity in their country with regards to age, gender, occupation, education, and so on. They have gone through a process of vision making, where they have delivered visions for the kind of future they would like to see for Europe. Those visions have gone through different processes with experts and stakeholders and turned into both research agendas and concrete research topics, which the citizens then again have commented on and further developed. So the Commission has been using that input to what is now these days being published as the last 2 years of the Horizon 2020 program. So that's an example of upstream citizen participation in research and innovation development and policies. The second example I would like to give is Worldwide Views. Worldwide Views is a multi-site citizen participation / consultation method, and it has been developed back in 2008 and 2009 when the climate COP came to Copenhagen. So the rationale was a bit similar to the one you're now talking about in ILO, about how do you engage citizens directly in what is already an established discussion between well-defined actors. With regards to the UN negotiations on climate, you have a set environment where governments negotiate, but also big stakeholders, stakeholder organizations, both industry and green NGOs, have found a way to interact with these negotiations. But there has been no mechanisms introduced for involving lay people directly. So that's what we developed a method for. And here the rationale is, or the method is to have 100 citizens in each participating country. Again, lay citizens selected to reflect the demographic diversity in their country. In advance, they receive written information material about the issues that they are going to discuss when they meet. A set of questions has been developed in collaboration with stakeholder organizations, experts, and governments. And these questions reflect some of the key issues and questions that are negotiated at the Climate COP. And the background information provides facts, but also different views on some of the alternative policy solutions at hand. So this is a method for more downstream participation, where different policy options have been formulated and there's a disagreement about these policy options, or at least different ways to go and different concrete choices you can make. The citizens then meet on the same day all around the world, 100 in one country, 100 in the other. They go through the same process. They sit in small groups, moderated by table moderators, and then they go through 4 or 5 different thematic sessions. Each session is then initiated by an information video, and after that they have around 1 hour to sit and discuss in these small groups about a set of questions for that session, between 5 and 10. They try to persuade each other of their own opinion, but they also listen to each other. At the end of each session, they vote individually on the policy options that they prefer, and those results are then put online. And here you can compare results from one country to another, developing to developed, different negotiations groups and so on. And yes, they are chosen randomly. You can call it random selection, but in practice there are very different methodologies for doing it in individual countries, depending on the possibilities they have. For example, in Denmark, we send out, maybe 10,000 different letters because we have a central registry, and then we get maybe 300, 400, 500 responses from people who want to apply for participating. And out of that group, we select a group that reflects the statistics of demographic diversity in our country. In other countries, they might recruit them on the street. They might use snowball methodology, but the same idea applies, that the group they select has to reflect the demographic diversity of their country. So of course, the crucial thing is that policymakers will look at the results and think that they are trustworthy in terms of providing a snapshot of public opinion on some of the issues that they are negotiating on. We last did this in 2015, leading up to the Climate COP in Paris, working with UNFCCC and the French government. There were 76 countries participating, and the results were fed quite actively by the UNFCCC and the French government to negotiators, politicians, for half a year prior to the actual COP itself. Yes, that was your first question. Should I continue with the other two, or?
Yeah. Maybe before we move to the other two questions, I mean, the question on randomness, that you have already addressed that one. There's another question coming in from Derek, and he says you mentioned some of the tools. If you could specify some of the IT-related tools that have been in use, and referring to IT tools in general, social media, or anything else that is internet or technology enabled. If you could give some examples on that one before we move to the second and the third question.
Yes. In a way, it relates to the third question, I would say, because does the digital development lead to more division, or does it lead to more participation? There's no, in our opinion and experience for doing technology assessments for many years, there's no technological determinism. It doesn't exist. So, I mean, you can use these digital developments for both the one thing or the other, or it can lead to different developments depending on how you use it. There are digital tools available for citizen participation, but they're not very good at the moment. You can make an online survey, you can have an online chat function, but none of them really compare with face-to-face deliberation, which provides a depth to the response from citizens that is difficult to achieve with online tools. Having said that, we are trying to develop it. We're in a project called e-Youth, which is trying to build an online tool for youth participation, and is about to finish early next year. And we're also in the process of developing our own tool called Engage Suite, which will allow for a combination of different participation methods. That's the direct methodology for citizen participation as we understand it, namely a process of random selection, informed deliberation connected to decision-making processes. But you also have open governance tools. You have governments putting different draft decisions online, making them open to comment and things like that. So some administrations and governments do make use of the digital development to try to include more people in an effort to be more transparent. I'm not sure if this is a good enough response, but it's an attempt.
You know, just what we clearly get from your answer specifically, that there's no technological determinism, so that there's a focus more on, let's say, the process that facilitates the entire process, with also a slight preference still for, let's say, the traditional face-to-face events or meetings that you have, but that you're at the same time exploring through some new technologies on how they could complement the process or facilitate the process even more. I think that was very clear. I think on the technology side, there was also a question that I skipped in the beginning a little bit, and it's specifically a bit that kind of resistance of technology, or being scared of the technology. Now also in the future of work debate, where I mean there's all kinds of doom scenarios of jobs disappearing, of automatization, robotization, digitization, replacing everything. So there's this kind of awareness also some positive or some exploring what could be then the potential of technology to contribute in a constructive way to this future of work decision. So far, we have been concentrating quite a lot on, let's say, the methodology. You said it, both in normative terms and also in terms of methodological ownership, trust, transparency. That would be the way forward to conduct this conversation. And I think now we're trying to find what could be the potential role. In this discussion, we fully agree there's no technological determinism. Secondly, we were looking, maybe there are some other examples to overcome that kind of initial resistance, and you were referring already to one or two examples that you're developing. Any other thoughts on the role of technology in this entire discussion?
Well, I mean, I guess an acknowledgement that jobs are going to be lost and there are going to be replacements. So the fear and resistance that some people and workers have is well founded. So what is the response to that? I mean, probably not to try to tell them that this is not a problem, but more a question of how do we guide and steer the development in a way that is less harmful than it otherwise would be. That's the technology side of it. The other one is which has absolutely nothing to do with technology, but is about, okay, how can we help these people to make a change of direction in their lives?
Thanks. One question that is coming in out here, and that maybe also can be connected to both questions that we have already dealt with, and it's also linked to our previous workshop we had, that one of the big dimensions that's coming out of this discussion is the issue of inequality. And it's actually your methods. You already said in terms of methodology, they're fully participatory, fully inclusive. But how do you, for example, engage vulnerable groups that maybe sometimes are harder to reach out to, or maybe that are not completely familiar with the types of consultation processes that you set up? What kind of measures do you take in order to include vulnerable groups? And like in a way, I would like to address the inclusion question here and maybe get some additional reflections from your side.
Yes, I mean, it's not an issue we have very big experience with in Denmark, which is one of the most equal societies in the world, I know. But we've discussed it often with our partners in the Worldwide Views Alliance, and some of them develop different, methods for doing so. For example, like if there are vulnerable groups, an over-representation is in order because they're usually small, so they need a safe space, so to speak, in order to participate in some of these processes. So that has actually been the case in different countries, like in Canada, flying in Inuit peoples and things like that. So over-representation in dialogues or deliberations is one method, and the other is simple things like having rules for good dialogue, having table moderators to run a good process that makes sure that everyone is heard. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a much better answer than that.
Thanks, Björn. Now, of course, as you have said it, the example is coming from the most equal societies that we have in Northern Europe, and the big idea of this dialogue conversation was also, let's confront it with the other part of the work, and that's why we would have loved Urvashi to hear her perspective of involvement, inclusion, and inequalities in her position as the director of Tandem Research. But Kai, just as a quick in between, we probably didn't reach out to her as I don't see her online.
Yeah, I am in the process of reaching out to her. We are communicating via email, but her joining WebEx, we are trying our best to make sure that she can join. But yeah, I will keep on making an effort to make that happen. Okay, apologies.
Okay. No.
I can maybe say a little more about this. I mean, for example, our worldwide use partners in India have used a methodology where, for example, at the small group deliberations, you let low-caste people, for example, have their own table. In Afghanistan, you let women sit at their own table, so that they are not, bullied by men in the conversation. So that's another way of making safe spaces for, if not vulnerable, then subordinate groups.
Yep, thanks. No, it was also one of the questions that I wanted to ask, if these methodologies, I mean, they have been becoming more and more popular. I'm coming from Belgium, and just I think it was a few years ago that there was this big, we called it the G1000, where they selected a representative group of people, 1,000 people that represent Belgium, including everyone in society. And the whole first online phase was basically online moderated, based upon which they selected then 1,000 people to come to Brussels to engage in a similar process that what you have mentioned, these kind of citizen panels. My question after going through the whole process as well was, if you looked at from different cultural perspectives, would there be also a kind of a methodological bias on how we see to come to consensus, discuss dialogue in very specific ways? And the idea of also of the follow-up of this webinar is to look to some methodologies in very different contexts. You already referred to the worldwide view and examples from Afghanistan or India. It would be very interesting to see how, from what kind of perspective they see these type of methodologies. I'm inviting also the other participants, if you have a specific question for Bjorn, please feel free to put it into the chat box and we'll taking it up. There's one question that Kai has picked up, because you mentioned climate change, the concepts of adaptation, mitigation, as well resilience are central to the COP21 Paris agreements. If you look at these concepts, could you see any relevance for the future of work dialogues? That's one question coming in. Another question that is coming in privately here is, what kind of, this has been already mentioned there, what kind of mechanisms do you have to enhance trust? I think at least once or twice we came up with methodological issues that could foster that kind of trust. I'm looking to the other participants, Melba, Monica, please feel free to put in any question, not necessarily on let's say the engagement or methodological discussion, but also on the other one. I've got one from Melba, from the Philippines. Unequal societies must learn from your ways or policies in Denmark, being one of the most equal societies. So that is just a comment. And okay, feel free to add any other questions. Maybe Bjorn, you want to reflect on these previous reflections?
Yes. I'm struggling with the connection between the Paris Agreement and the future of work dialogue. I probably need help here to to make a
Maybe I also,
connection.
because I'm going to ask it to to Kai, who's putting the question on
Yeah.
board. Kai, what do you mean? With
Yeah. So for myself, in my past life, I guess I worked on climate change adaptation, and I think often when we talk about the future of work, when we talk about the economic and the unemployment and the social and the political shocks that might happen, I think a lot of these shocks are lay near, like in terms of when we talk about different systems, right? So now we are more engaged with this future of work within the world of work labor system, but the same concepts of how do we adapt, towards a future of work we want, is a question that I think mirrors some of the processes and the experiences of climate change, in my view, in the sense of, first when the Brundtland report first came out on sustainable development in the 1980s, I believe, that was the first marker of such a concept, and then gradually with Kyoto, followed by Copenhagen, followed by each of the COPs, the discussion has grew, right? And then and in addition to this, the international panel on climate change was also formed, which also won the Nobel Peace Prize along with Al Gore. So there were, like, in terms of like how do we confront very complex issues, I think climate change is a very good example. And then now when we think about this future of work, it's a very similar type of issue where there's no one answer, and then there's going to be a full diversity of potential best practices, because I don't even think there's one or two solutions. So I'm just saying, okay, first, like, there are these political processes that are happening, and then followed by the formation of IPCC, and then that has led us to the agreement, and then now bond is underway. And I think with this future of work conversation, it is not going to end at 2019. This has to be a longer term project, like in terms of all the different pieces, and then and because of the evolution of how tech and other global trends are going to be factored in. Yeah, so I do see there's a lot of parallel, but also I just want to see your views on this.
Yes. No. Okay. I see what you mean. So it's a question of a parallel, and I completely agree. I mean, climate change and sustainable development is a bigger problem. It's a complex challenge. So in order to address that challenge, it is not enough to have a discussion with the usual suspects. You need also, as part of that, to have mechanisms for direct citizen participation. In, for example, the question of sustainable development, what you can see or maybe start to detect is a backlash because the whole discussion and development is driven by a combination of green NGOs and governments. So the problem is that you have a larger segment, a growing segment of the population, for example, in the US, and Trump is an example of that looks as the green NGOs as not anymore someone who is speaking truth to power, but someone who is speaking truth with power. So they get distrustful of these proponents of sustainable development, looking at them as just another organization trying to tell them what to do and how to do it. And they want to be involved in the conversation. So there's a lot of untapped energy here. Also in the field of climate adaptation, when you have a problem in a municipality, we see this all the time. You call the engineers and they say, oh, what is the solution? But behind every technical solution, there's a political choice. So if the engineer comes back and say, oh, we need to do this and this to protect the summer house area, maybe this is not the right solution in the long run, that all the resources in the municipality is spent on protecting what is there, if in the long term it's better to let nature take its course. So I agree. There are many parallels with climate change and sustainable development and the discussion about the future work and society.
Thanks a lot. We might get some inspiration from other parallel, wicked, complex discussion. I want to refer back to the political dimension here, because Derek is putting a comment that I think makes a lot of sense. Like to come back to the inclusion question, you gave some examples there from Afghanistan and from India, and how we could involve vulnerable groups. So to create safe spaces, you said like maybe we first need to have a separate discussion within, let's say, the safe environment of their own type of group. And Derek says like, well, that methodological notion is the possible option of creating separate spaces for vulnerable groups. Would that not perpetuate the segregation that they already might suffer in society? So maybe we have not been elaborating enough on the methodology, but also any choice in methodology might underlie also a political dimension or a choice, and not necessarily be inclusive from the start. But maybe you were focusing more on the safe space, on involving them before mixing up the dialogue. I just wanted to get that view from you as well.
I mean, here the conversation we've had with partners around the world have mirrored that discussion, the precise discussion. That our position has been to, say that all citizens should be mixed in this exercise, and try to insist on that as far as we could get. But then we would have some partners in some countries saying that this is simply not going to work in our country. We have to do it. We have to give a safe space to these and these people. So place them at a separate table, maybe even in a separate room, but being part of the same event on the same day. So I agree, what to do. So that's a concrete discussion of methodology in each individual case, I would say.
Okay, thanks. I'm trying also to capture some of the comments that are coming in, and it's focusing quite a lot on one hand on equality, and on the other hand on technology. I'm also inviting the participants to come in if they would like to address one of the let's say issues that we are currently discussing. I think there's a lot of interest in some best practices, as you have mentioned. So one thing that we definitely would like to do is maybe refer to some of the websites or the projects that you have been involved with, so that we can also include it in our massive online open course. I think the question also that the issue of inequality and division is coming back in many forms. And I think Melba, who's saying that every time a new development or technology comes up, a new form of divide surfaces. So the question is like, how do we address inequality at its very core? How do we make people have access to the basics of necessities. And I think there that discussion also in the previous webinar is coming back always from different perspectives, from the development perspective, from maybe really highly developed countries that focus too much on, let's say, the new technologies where there are also a lot of inequalities are arising. So that might be a discussion that after this webinar we would like to continue a bit more elaborating with different arguments. I don't know, Björn, if you have anything to add to that
I
from
do.
your perspective. Yeah.
I mean, two things. I mean, basically, participatory methods is a way to address and reverse developments towards inequality. And the question about whether, you know, there's a different methods in different countries and how can we do it in developing countries, I would say that, you know, everyone gets it, you know. I mean, there's no political context in which they don't get this, and they think that, oh, this is a very strange concept coming from a Scandinavian country. I mean, it's intuitively accepted by both the citizens and the politicians in far the majority of countries, and especially also in developing countries. So having these participatory methods is a way of creating transparency, anticipation, reflexivity, and basically calling out inequality structures, which are then easier to address. That is one thing. Then about the development of methodology, of technology, is, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a big group of people in Europe, for example, or the Western world that discusses responsible research and innovation. And the discussion is also most predominant in research circles and less so in industry. So trying to push for reflections on what is a responsible research and innovation strategy for big industries is important. And it is also important that that discussion doesn't just take place internally, for example, in Europe or internally in the US, but that it is a global discussion because, of course, technologies travel, and to try and see, anticipate what will given technological development, how would that travel, and what kind of impacts could there be. The European Commission is taking a few steps very tentatively in that direction, namely by having a few more research projects that are looking at global responsible research and innovation, and is trying to connect with other countries around the world in a discussion about how do we introduce either this concept or similar principles in research and innovation. But of course, I mean, it's often an uphill struggle against bigger forces of economy. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Björn, for this reflections, and we're almost arriving towards the end of this webinar. I think we'll have to do a follow-up webinar where we confront most of the outputs of these discussions with Urvashi, so also to get a different viewpoint from her situation on that. And we're currently writing up all the different, let's say, reflection points and questions that we have discussed already. And maybe there's space for one or two final questions. And we have Christian Vivas coming on the chat box here, and he said that there are two different aspects in this matter. On the one hand, the capacity of resilience of the states and the people for the direct one against the inequalities and inequities. On the other hand, how can the workers of the new era adapt to the disruption of their working life? What tools do they need besides their needs to survive based on a salary? What aspects of your training of the worker versus the new era and experience should be expanded to be able to be hand in hand with the new technologies in the workplace? That is substantial comments coming from Christian. And there might be also maybe a final reflection, and you see it a lot when discussions are positioned as the future we want. I mean, this is also recently what the ILO initiated, the future of work we want. At this stage of what you have been observing from your perspective, what kind of we do you see they are referring to? We all know ideally the we should be expanded to the pentagonal discussion that we already referred to, but what kind of outside impression is on the kind of we are currently involved in? That would be interesting to hear it from your view. Maybe with these two reflections, we're coming to the first end of this initial conversation. Over to you, Bjorn.
Yes, I mean, seen from the outside, you know, the we you are referring to has, I mean, it's mostly been organized interests that have been involved in the discussion as far as I can see from the outside. So far as I understand it, you have not yet tried to or have the capacity or the methods to involve lay citizens / workers in providing their input to the kind of future they would like to see. So I mean that would be my suggestion and my to the ILO to consider using some of those methods that are actually available. They do exist to try and engage. You know, of course, you cannot engage everyone, but I mean a sort of diverse sample of citizens and workers to introduce that as another voice to in the discussion of the future work we want. Yeah.
Good, thanks. And any other comments on the new adaptation to the new area for workers? That comment from Christian that was coming in, or other participants also are allowed to react on that one?
Maybe I would give that one a pass. I think it's more of a comment to agree on, I guess, than a question. Yeah.
Yeah, and also it's a bit the central theme of the massive online open course that is currently running. And this question I'll ask Kai to put it immediately in one of the discussion forums we are putting in there, because it's a recurrent comment and statement that is coming back. I think this conversation or this short conversation was great specifically to see what kind of methodologies could we enhance to actually upgrade the dialogue on the future of work involving all potential stakeholders. And this connects well with a whole bunch of issues that we have been discussing in the last weeks on inequality, on inclusion, on innovation, on the role of technology. It's kind of interesting that throughout the different, this is already the fourth webinar, the same themes are popping up, but each time they are addressed through a very specific angle, and this angle was through the, let's say, the engagement angle, the participatory angle, and how from also, I would say, from even a governance perspective on how do you address this kind of discussion in its broadest sense so that it represents the complexity of the topic that we have in front of us, and how can we do right to that complexity. I think you gave us a lot of examples that we definitely should take into account. We're closely respecting the time limits of these webinars because we have all very busy schedules in the world of work. So I would like to thank you, Bjorn, for participating in this webinar. Also, the other participants for asking thoughtful questions. They will continue the conversation in the course that we are currently running, and the recording will also be available in that course, and hopefully we are able to catch up with Urvashi, and the type of answers and feedback she will give to your statements, we will also provide it to you. Thanks again, and have a nice afternoon.
Yes, thank you very much, and sorry if I didn't. If I couldn't answer all your questions, I couldn't follow everything in the chat box, but I just posted my email if anyone wants to ask a question directly.
Okay, excellent. bb@technode.dk is noted. Thanks a lot, and goodbye, everybody. Bye.
Goodbye, and thank you.